What eventually breaks the attachment to a controlling person isn't willpower. It's a specific internal shift that researchers see time and time again when emotional dependence just collapses. We generally assume that to leave a toxic dynamic, you have to find this sudden burst of courage or anger. But the reality is so much quieter. So why is it that fighting often makes the bond even stronger, while silence and neutrality make it disappear? Well, that's the core paradox of what we're talking about today, the emotional severance process. It's about that exact moment a manipulator's words stop being a weapon and just start being noise.
Think about that. All the energy you might spend trying to fight back, to argue, to just make them see your point of view, the research shows that's not actually what severs the connection. The real break is internal. It's silent. And a lot of the time, it happens without any big external drama. It's a fascinating and frankly fundamental paradox.
And that right there, that is the core of what we're exploring. It's all about how a person reaches this exact point. That moment, their carefully chosen words, the ones designed to provoke and control, simply lose all their power. It's like they become static on a radio. You can still hear them, sure, but they're just meaningless noise.
So, the big question is, how do you get to that point of neutrality? How does this quiet internal shift actually happen? Well, to answer that, we need to unpack the entire emotional severance process, step by step.
So, here's our roadmap. We're going to start by untangling the willpower paradox. Then, we'll look at the problem-solving trap that keeps people stuck. From there, we'll map out the 3 phases of the internal recalibration, get into the conflicting psychological needs that fuel the whole dynamic, and then we'll cover a practical tool called the observation shift. And finally, we'll talk about what it really means to realize you've already left.
All right, let's kick things off with the willpower paradox. This is so crucial because emotional severance isn't about one single moment of defiance. It's not some dramatic outburst. No, it's a documented cognitive shift. It's like a systematic update to your entire mental operating system.
And this right here is the absolute key. Locus of control. It's just a psychology term for where you believe power comes from. In these dynamics, your locus of control slowly shifts to the outside. You start looking to the other person for validation, for the official story, for your own sense of who you are. Emotional severance is the process of yanking that power back, of bringing your locus of control back home, inside yourself. It's a total rewiring of where you source your reality.
And this isn't just about one kind of relationship. This dynamic can pop up all over the place, in high-pressure jobs, in really rigid family structures, you name it. But the one common thread, the engine that powers this whole thing, is a really powerful psychological tool called intermittent reinforcement.
So what is this thing? Well, intermittent reinforcement basically hijacks our brain's reward system. It's the exact same principle that makes slot machines in Vegas so addictive. See, if you were punished every single time, you just leave. If you were rewarded every time, you'd feel secure. But the unpredictable mix of kindness one minute and hostility the next, that creates this constant state of hope and anxiety. You just keep pulling the lever, hoping for the reward. And that creates this incredibly powerful, addictive bond that logic and willpower alone just can't seem to break.
Okay, so this pattern of reinforcement creates a very specific mental trap. It turns you into an obsessive problem solver in a game that is completely rigged from the very start. And this is the phase where people get so exhausted and confused because they're working so hard, but they're getting absolutely nowhere.
And this slide shows the pivot point. It's the move from problem solving to pattern recognition. When you're in the trap, you really believe the problem is solvable. You think, if I can just explain it better, or if I can just be a little more patient, I can fix this. But the shift, the real shift, happens when you stop trying to solve them and you start just observing the data. You realize their behavior isn't a reaction to you, it's just a fixed pattern. And suddenly, your goal is no longer to earn their approval, it's just to observe the facts and keep yourself safe.
Now, this is where it gets really fascinating. This shift isn't random at all. It's like your brain, in its attempt to solve what has become a totally intolerable conflict, starts to systematically dismantle the attachment itself. And researchers have actually observed 3 distinct phases of this internal recalibration.
So these 3 steps, value de-linkage, narrative sovereignty, and emotional resource reallocation, they form the sequence of detachment. Now, they might not happen overnight, but they represent a really clear, observable process as the mind starts to free itself. So let's break each one down.
This first step is absolutely monumental.
For so long, their approval or disapproval is directly wired into your sense of self-worth. If they get angry, your first thought is, what did I do wrong? Value de-linkage is the moment that wire gets cut. You see their outburst not as a reflection of your value, but just as a reflection of their own internal chaos. It breaks that chemical link between their actions and your feeling of collapse. It's just no longer about you.
And that leads directly to the next critical step. After you de-link your value, you start to reclaim your own story. In these dynamics, there's often this constant rewriting of history, a kind of gaslighting where your own memory is called into question. Narrative sovereignty is when you stop outsourcing your reality to them. You start trusting what you saw, what you heard, and what you felt, even if they're telling you it never happened. You take back the authority to define your own experience.
This is the final and maybe the most profound stage. Just think for a second about all the mental energy spent trying to predict their moods, analyze their texts, and manage their reactions. It's a full-time job. Well, in this phase, all of that energy gets reallocated back to you, to your goals, your needs, your life. Their provocations are suddenly met with neutrality, not because you're forcing it, but because you're no longer providing the emotional fuel they're looking for. The space in your mind that was once full of anxiety about them, it just becomes a quiet space for you.
So you might be asking, why does this dynamic go on for so long in the first place? Why is it so hard to get to that point? Well, it's because both people are being driven by powerful, deeply ingrained, and fundamentally conflicting psychological needs. It's like you're playing two completely different games on the same board. Your brain is desperately seeking coherence. It's trying to solve the puzzle of cognitive dissonance. How can this person be so kind one minute and so cruel the next? You're just trying to make it all make sense. But their motivation is totally different. They're seeking supply. That's a term for the emotional fuel they get from your reactions, good or bad. Your confusion isn't a bug, it's a feature. They need you to keep trying to solve the puzzle to stay in the game.
And on top of that, there's this huge cognitive bias that keeps people locked in, the sunk cost fallacy. It's that little voice in your head that says, but I've put so much time into this, or I've tried so hard, I can't just give up now. The sunk cost fallacy makes us overvalue what we've already invested and totally undervalue the massive future cost of staying. That internal shift we've been talking about? It often happens the moment you realize that the cost of one more day is higher than all the years you've already put in.
Okay, so we've covered the theory, the why behind all this. But what does this internal shift actually look like in day-to-day life? This is where awareness turns into practical, defensive actions that actually protect your mental space. It all starts with something called the observation shift. This is a subtle but incredibly powerful change in perspective. You stop being a participant in the drama and you become a researcher of the dynamic. Instead of taking an insult personally, you start seeing it as just another piece of data. This creates this crucial psychological distance that works like a shield.
And here's what that sounds like in your own head. Instead of feeling a wave of guilt, you just observe the tactic. You mentally note, interesting. This is the part where they're attempting to elicit guilt. Or, okay, I see, that's the classic blame-shifting maneuver. Just by naming the behavior for what it is, a tactical move, you strip it of its emotional power. It stops being a personal attack and just becomes a predictable move in a game you're not even playing anymore. And as you get better at being an observer, you naturally stop falling into something called the JADE trap. You stop justifying your decisions, arguing over their version of reality, defending your character, and explaining your feelings. And why? Because you finally realize you're trying to get them to understand a reality they have absolutely no interest in accepting. The point of their questions isn't understanding, it's engagement, it's control.
And this all leads to one of the most liberating realizations of all. You do not need them to understand your boundaries for those boundaries to be real. A boundary is not a negotiation. It doesn't need their approval. It is a unilateral declaration of what you will and will not accept. The moment you stop needing them to agree with your boundary is the moment it becomes real and incredibly powerful.
So when you put all of these pieces together, the pattern recognition, the reallocation of your own energy, setting boundaries without apology, it all builds to this one final, really profound realization about what emotional freedom actually is. And it's often not what we think.
Ultimately, what you come to understand is that their story about you, their criticisms, their judgments, none of it has any real power on its own. It's a narrative, and its power is entirely granted by you. The cycle breaks the very moment you revoke that authority. The moment you realize that their disapproval isn't a reflection of your worth, but is actually a signal of their loss of control over you. It's evidence that you're getting free.
And that really is the ultimate takeaway from the entire emotional severance process. It teaches us that you don't find peace by winning the war. You don't need some final dramatic victory. Peace comes from the quiet, internal realization that you've simply stopped being a soldier in their war. You've already walked off the battlefield. The game is over because you are no longer playing.